Welcome to Cut to the Chase, where we talk about compelling legal, regulatory, and public interest information and news. Your host is Greg Goldfarb, an attorney, entrepreneur, investor, and activist.
All right, folks, it's time for our favorite podcast, Cut to the Chase. Anti-Semitism is becoming a bigger issue than I would like to see. And since the October 7th Hamas attack, lots of things are changing or getting worse. For the first time I've ever seen anti-Zionism conflated with anti-Semitism. What is that? What it's all about? We're going to go over that today. The acts of anti-Semitism. This is probably one of the hardest podcasts I've ever had to prepare for, because as I continue to prepare for it, things continue to happen. Concert got canceled at the House of Blues in Chicago. Jewish reggae star who had a sold-out concert, Matisyahu, had to cancel it due to threats. Lots of stuff going on at the campuses, not all around the United States, but Northwestern. I think 10 minutes before I turned on the program today, I think I saw that a United Kingdom court sentenced someone for basically inciting terrorism against Jews online. So the online campuses and all that. And I brought Brian Siegel on today, the regional director of the American Jewish Committee in Miami Broward office. Lots of connections with world leaders, diplomats, elected officials, community leaders, ethnic and religious groups. He's done a lot of interfaith activities, been named Achiever in the Miami Today Business Magazine, 20 under 40 top emerging business leaders in Miami. Appointed by the Miami-Dade County Commissioner, member of the Community Relations Board, life member and Council on Foreign Relations, and is on the Florida Advisory Board of the U.S. Global Leadership. Sorry for the lengthy intro, but I also want to discuss a little bit about what the American Jewish Committee is. It's a global advocacy organization for the Jewish people. They are nonpartisan, so they don't really you're not going to hear discussions pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Biden today. But in any event, I've said too much. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm good, Greg. I'm honored to be with you. Thanks.
And I thank you. We know each other, actually. We Temple Judaeum and Coral Gables. One of the parts of Brian's bio that was missing is the fact that his wife, Judith Siegel, is the rabbi at that congregation. Great rabbi, magnificent rabbi. Her and Fish, Jonathan, run really a top flight program there. But we've got so many topics to cover today. We can't get too deep into your wife's, what she's all about, what she's doing.
Sure.
But before we even really get into the discussion, Brian and I prepared for this beforehand, and one of the things that Brian said was that before we really can talk about and understand anti-Semitism, we have to understand who are Jews. So let's talk about that, Brian. Why is that even relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again, Greg, for having me on. And you mentioned AJC, American Jewish Committee. We've been around since 1906. We were founded in the wake of the pogroms in Kishinev, Moldova, when American Jews had come to the United States, and many had succeeded and decided to come together, because even though their lives were improving in the United States, there was still discrimination in certain quarters in the United States, but nothing compared to what their brothers and sisters were facing back in the former Soviet Union area. And they realized that the Jewish community needed to have a collective voice to Congress and the administration to stand up against hatred that was still based on simply Jewish identity. And so from that small group that was formed a committee and called themselves the American Jewish Committee, we are now an organization with 24 offices in the United States, 14 international offices, partnerships with Jewish communities in over 30 countries, diplomatic relationships with world leaders in over 90 countries, and really focused on these issues, on combating anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry and hate, on promoting Israel's right to peace and security, and on democracy for everyone and human rights for everyone. So to your question, many times people think that the Jewish community is monolithic, and you have to really understand Jews and Judaism before you wade into this conversation, because Judaism is a religion, but it's also an ethnicity and a culture and a peoplehood. We are a multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic people. Being Jewish means it sort of originates from the land of Judea, the original land of Israel. Jews originate from that land, and that's how we became known as Jews. And so many times people try and paint the Jewish community with a broad brush, but it's a very diverse community. There are 15.2 million Jews in the world, roughly, and Jews make up around 2% of the American population. In Israel, there are around 7.2 million Jews, so it's a country smaller than New Jersey. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of, the variety of the Jewish community and the fact that we are still a very small community. We haven't even reached the numbers we were at before the Holocaust. So we're still a very small community, but very influential community, and therefore, well known throughout the world.
So when we talk about anti-Semitism, I think people just kind of throw that term around and they never really even think, what does that mean? Are you don't like Jewish people? It's really a term I think that we need to drill down on, and it really has not been in existence for the entirety of the human population, and I do believe that there probably were acts that would be considered anti-Semitic before the term even really, I guess, got formalized. So let's talk about the definition and how that came about, when that came about.
Sure. So, I think many people understand what you said, which is that the hatred of Jews is many times been referred to as the world's oldest hatred. It's been with us for thousands of years. And we can talk a little bit about, different forms it's taken over time. But the term anti-Semitism was coined actually by an anti-Semite himself, who was trying to racially classify people by Semitic languages. It sort of doesn't necessarily apply directly, but it's become the common parlance and the term that's used when talking about anti-Jewish hatred. But there was the perception that the term needed to be defined, because it is many times not identified. There's so many different permutations. There's so many different types of anti-Semitism that it was deemed by the international community to be important to be able. How do you fight something if you can't define it, if you can't really identify it? So there's an organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The acronym is IHRA. And they essentially initiated in 1998 a process with their member countries, which was over 30 countries, that came together to essentially create a definition. And basically, the way that they defined it was to say that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. So that gives you just a very basic definition. Certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. But this definition, this IHRA working definition, has that core text, but then it's followed by 11 examples of classic, and contemporary forms of anti-Semitism. So, that was a tool that has been used because, as you say, some people understand what constitutes anti-Semitism. Others might hear a certain conspiracy theory or a trope and not realize that what they're encountering is blatant anti-Semitism.
And I think to some degree, what's going on with anti-Zionism being conflated with anti-Semitism and how that's kind of playing out right now, I think makes the definition even more important, because Zionism is one thing, anti-Semitism, they can overlap, but Zionism is really more of Israeli-centric, whereas the Jewish people is a global people. I mean, that we've lived everywhere pretty much. And
Yeah,
we've
in
been
fact,
kicked out of lots of places.
one of the 11 examples within the definition of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism is sort of when you cross the line into anti-Semitism based on anti-Zionism. And the concept, of course, is that criticism of Israel is perfectly legitimate. If you are, criticizing a policy of the government, or you're criticizing the government itself, or you're criticizing military actions, that Israel, like any country, can be criticized, and it's a democracy. And if you ever visit Israel, or if you ever read the Israeli press or watch the Israeli press, you'll see that there are many critics of policies, of positions, of stances, but we sort of were able to, through Natan Sharansky, a famous refusenik from the former Soviet Union, who has gone on to be a leader in Israel and in world Jewry, and he established a litmus test for how do you kind of discern when anti-Israel sentiment descends into anti-Semitism. He called it the 3Ds test. And he sort of said, if it's demonization of Israel, if there's delegitimization of Israel, or if there's double standards. So if you're simply demonizing Israel because you're trying to say that it doesn't have a right to exist, and same with delegitimization, or if you're holding Israel to a double standard that no other country in the world would be held to, that's when you get into this sort of area of crossing the line between simply criticizing Israel's behavior or policies versus anti-Semitism.
All right, so give the audience a little background of Zionism. When did that begin? Was it a movement? How does that relate to Israel and the Jewish people?
Sure. So, and this also, of course, relates back to the conversation about anti-Semitism, since the times of the founding of Christianity, when, under Roman rule, when Christianity was widely accepted, the Jewish community was very much seen as having, it was taught within society that Jews had lost their connection. It had been superseded, the connection to God, that Jews were, in some corners, they were seen to be satanic or different, or, said that they were always trying to create problems in society. There's a common trope of Jews poisoning the well during times of plague, that Jews were responsible for many of the problems in society, really the scapegoating of the Jewish community, that as a minority was not really able to defend itself. And, of course, this happened throughout European society for centuries. When an observer, Theodor Herzl, saw the Dreyfus affair in France, where he saw this French soldier who, decorated French soldier, who essentially was accused of espionage and of being a traitor. And really, the only evidence presented was that he was Jewish, and therefore couldn't be deemed to be trustworthy or a full citizen. And I think when Theodor Herzl saw this, it really confirmed for him the anti-Semitism that he was seeing in European society, and realizing that the only way the Jewish people could truly be safe is to have a state of their own. He wrote several books about this, one called The Old New Land, Alt Neuland. He really promoted this message through what was called several Zionist congresses, in Europe to convince the powers establishment that the Jewish people deserved and needed their own state. And of course, as we know, this wasn't heeded, and we saw what happened in the 1930s in Germany with the rise of the Nazi regime, and of course leading to the Holocaust, 6 million Jews killed, and the aftermath. And so that was really the founding of Zionism, which really has in many ways preceded that, because if you think of Zionism as the idea that the Jewish people want to have sovereignty in their own historical homeland, that's been something that for thousands of years, Jews have prayed towards Jerusalem from the diaspora. We talk about it Passover next year in Jerusalem. It's in our liturgy, it's in our Torah. So we've always had a connection to the land of Israel, and there's always been a yearning for Jews to be able to return to our homeland.
All right. So you got the late 19th century in Europe. You have pogroms going on in Russia. I mean, that's sort of how my family ended up coming here. Although I didn't interview them, but that's basically when my family, and that's the common understanding. And lots of Jews in America arrived here, Ellis Island, all that, because of the pogroms. And then you have the Zionist movement that's trying to have a state for the Jewish people, Israel. But talk about the fact that even back in those days, there were Jews that opposed Zionism.
Well, yeah, first of all, to your point, which is, there's a long history, and I encourage people to learn more about it, of Jews being expelled from countries, from England, from Spain, from many, many countries, where, again, in certain countries, Jews were put in ghettos, and other countries, really forced to only be able to work in certain professions, and definitely, as I said before, became the scapegoat of many societies when there were ills within society. The Jewish community was really defenseless and the subject of attacks. Pogroms is the word that you used, and it's the one that really connotes for many Jews this sense of helplessness of the larger majority society attacking Jewish communities simply because they either got drunk or they wanted to blame the Jewish community for a variety of ills. These forms of anti-Semitism. There's blood libels of that Jews killed children and used blood in the matzah. I mean, all kinds of what seemed to us very bizarre, sort of forms of anti-Semitism that were used to attack and kill Jews. And so I think, there was certainly a movement of understanding that we needed to find a place where the Jews could be safe in their identity, and to be able to pray in their houses of worship safely, and to live their lives safely. There's, of course, an element within different societies of levels of comfort of the Jewish community. And in America, which has been, the society that's been the most hospitable to the Jewish community. But of course, as we know, and of course, as we've seen in recent years, that doesn't mean that society is devoid of anti-Semitism. In fact, there has always been anti-Semitism in the U.S., but it's been a place where Jews have been able to thrive, and to really, based on this, concept of land of opportunity, the Jewish community sought education, opportunities in many parts of the country, including here in South Florida and Miami. Jews were not allowed to live in certain areas, were not allowed access to certain professions, or at least within certain law firms or medical professions, and had to start their own. and of course true with country clubs as well and other social activities. But there was concern, even as you mentioned, as you pointed out, in the 1940s, during and after World War II, of support for the creation of the State of Israel. But I think that after the UN made its decision to support a state of Israel, a state next to the Arab state for the Palestinians that was offered, that the vast majority of the Jewish community, after the War of Independence and certainly after the Six-Day War, saw that Israel really was there to stay and was needed by the Jewish community, and the pride in the state of Israel grew. So it's a long history, but an important one.
Yeah. So going back to the definition of anti-Semitism, you mentioned the IHRA, and just to kind of circle this last point, several countries have essentially adopted the definition. It looks like there's like over 30 countries that have adopted it. Why have the other 160 some odd countries not adopted it? Is that a form of anti-Semitism, or they just don't care, or it's?
I think it's a mixed bag. It's a variety of different reasons. There are other definitions that are out there. We believe that this is the most, widely accepted and most accurate and most helpful. The whole purpose of the definition is essentially so that monitors of anti-Semitism and law enforcement and government officials can have a sort of ability to understand what constitutes anti-Semitism. It's the same reasoning behind why at AJC we created a resource that I would commend, which is called Translate Hate. It's on our AJC website, ajc.org. And the whole idea of Translate Hate is that, again, there are so many different forms of anti-Semitism, and some people would recognize and others they wouldn't. And so, the types of conspiracy theories and stereotypes, all the stereotypes of Jews, of having control and trying to control society, these are very dangerous conspiracy theories that just seem to permeate societies. And we've even seen it here in the US, this concept of the replacement theory. This is what you heard when you heard the folks chanting in Charlottesville with their tiki torches, the white nationalists saying, Jews will not replace us. And it's this theory that claims that there's an intentional effort that's led by Jews to promote mass non-white immigration, intermarriage, and other efforts that would lead to the extinction of the white race. And so it's things like this type of replacement theory. This was, by the way, the rationale behind the killer of the Tree of Life synagogue, who went in to this synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 11 worshipers at prayer in a synagogue, and killed them simply for their Jewish identity, because he truly believed that Jews were trying to replace the white race. So it's very dangerous. It's this idea that Jews are manipulating these other ethnic groups to come in to the United States. And it's many people would just look at it and say it's insane, but it's many people believe it and many people act on it. So it can't be taken lightly or taken for granted. But to your point, many countries are trying to figure out how to deal with these issues in their own society and at large. And so we've advocated that this is the most helpful tool. It's just another tool in the toolkit. The working definition, our resource, Translate Hate. But the goal is that people will recognize and stand up to anti-Semitism.
So when you mentioned Charlottesville, just a personal note, I grew up down here in Miami and was, basically led a sheltered life. I don't think I really experienced anti-Semitism, and I never realized it was a big issue. And then when it came down to going to college, I said, you know what, I need to really get past my comfort zone. And so I went to University of Virginia, as did one of your good colleagues, Lawrence Lambert. Shout out to Lawrence, who's also a Miami attorney. And I think that was the last thing that we would have thought would happen at University of Virginia. But, that's just part of the history. And when you go through the history, in preparing today, I was a history major at University of Virginia. I was almost ashamed to see some of the, I know about the expulsions, Spain, England. I've known about the pogroms, obviously Nazi Germany, but I didn't realize that even as far back as like the New Testament, there was, anti-Semitic proclamations. And so it's been going on even before the formal definition in the 1990s, late 1990s. I guess even without a definition, the conduct could speak for itself.
I think that's true. And one of the revelations within what you're describing in terms of the relationship with the Catholic Church in particular, which had this sort of supersessionism, this idea that Christianity had superseded Israel in terms of a connection to God. But in 1965, with Vatican II, the teaching of the Church completely changed. And Pope John Paul basically stated that the Jews are the elder brothers of the Christian community and have never been cut off from their connection to God. And that changing of doctrine really made a huge difference and has made a huge difference, in terms of that relationship, and being able to stand up to some of those traditional forms of anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean that it doesn't still exist in certain quarters or it doesn't come up in certain liturgy, but it is vastly improved from where it was before.
That's all for this episode of Cut to the Chase. But before you go, will you open up your podcast app and give us a 5-star review? You can also leave a comment about what you liked most or other topics you'd like us to cover. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming shows. Thanks, everybody. Be safe out there.